Have you ever wondered why someone who once claimed to love you could simply vanish, leaving you to decode their absence like some cryptic puzzle? Did you ever find yourself staring at your phone, waiting for that text that never comes, wondering if they think about you at all? Well, my dear viewers, today we're going to unravel one of the most perplexing mysteries of modern love. Why avoidants regret leaving you but can't tell you. You see, there's a particular cruelty in the way some people exit our lives. They don't slam doors or throw accusations. They don't even give you the courtesy of a proper goodbye. They simply retreat. Like ghosts, they fade into the periphery of your existence, leaving you to wonder if what you shared was ever real at all. But here's what I've learned from decades of observing human nature. The very people who seem most capable of walking away are often the ones who suffer most in their leaving. The title of our discussion today speaks to a profound truth about human psychology and the attachment patterns that govern our most intimate relationships. When someone with an avoidant attachment style leaves you, they don't simply forget and move on as their behavior might suggest. Instead, they carry the weight of that decision like a stone in their chest, but they're constitutionally incapable of expressing that regret in ways you might recognize or understand. You see, the avoidant individual has spent a lifetime constructing elaborate defenses against vulnerability. They've learned, often through painful early experiences, that emotional dependency is dangerous territory. So when they find themselves genuinely caring for someone, when they discover that another person has somehow slipped past their carefully constructed barriers, it creates an internal crisis of monumental proportions. Think of it this way. Imagine spending your entire life believing that fire burns, only to find yourself drawn to a flame that feels warm instead of destructive. The rational mind knows what it has experienced, but the emotional system that has kept you safe for so long screams danger. This is the perpetual conflict that lives within the avoidant heart. What you'll discover in our time together today is not just why they regret their decision to leave, but how two fascinating psychological phenomena, loss aversion and self-serving bias, create a perfect storm of internal torment for these individuals. You'll understand why their regret manifests not in grand gestures or heartfelt apologies, but in subtle behaviors that most people miss entirely. You'll learn to recognize the signs of an avoidance remorse, even when they themselves might not fully understand what they're feeling. More importantly, you'll gain insight into whether this knowledge should change how you respond to someone who has left you in this particular way. Because understanding someone's psychology doesn't necessarily mean you should welcome them back into your life, does it? Sometimes, wisdom lies not in forgiveness, but in recognizing patterns that are unlikely to change. By the end of our conversation, you'll have a roadmap for navigating these complex emotional territories, whether you're hoping for reconciliation or seeking closure. You'll understand why the person who seemed so confident in their decision to leave might be privately questioning that choice every single day, and why their internal struggle doesn't necessarily translate into the kind of growth that would make a relationship with them viable. This matters because too many good people spend months or even years wondering if they were worth staying for, when the truth is far more complex and far less personal than they imagine. The avoidant's inability to stay isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a window into their own deep-seated fears about intimacy and connection. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect I once knew who could design the most intricate buildings but couldn't construct a simple sentence about his feelings. Marcus had been in a relationship with Sarah for nearly 2 years when he began what I call the Great Retreat. It started subtly, as it always does with avoidance. He began working later hours, finding reasons to postpone their weekend plans, responding to her texts with increasing brevity. Sarah, understandably, began to feel the distance. She asked him about it directly, which is precisely what terrifies an avoidant most. Direct emotional inquiry feels like being asked to defuse a bomb while wearing blindfolds. Marcus assured her everything was fine, but his behavior suggested otherwise. Within a month, he had ended the relationship with the classic avoidant explanation. He needed space to focus on his career. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have understood at the time, was the war being waged inside Marcus's mind. You see, he had fallen in love with her, perhaps for the first time in his life. But for someone with an avoidant attachment style, falling in love doesn't feel like floating on clouds. It feels like drowning. Every moment of happiness with Sarah was immediately followed by a voice in his head asking, what happens when she leaves? What happens when she sees who you really are and decides you're not worth staying for? The irony, of course, is that by leaving first, Marcus created the very abandonment he was trying to avoid. But here's where the psychology becomes fascinating. Within weeks of ending the relationship, Marcus was consumed by something he couldn't quite name. He found himself driving past Sarah's apartment building. He checked her social media obsessively, though he had blocked her on all platforms. He started going to the coffee shop where they used to meet, hoping for a glimpse of her. This is where loss aversion comes into play. Loss aversion is a psychological principle that suggests we feel the pain of losing something twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of gaining it. For most people, this might mean regretting a breakup and reaching out to reconcile. But for avoidants, loss aversion creates a unique kind of torture because their attachment system won't allow them to take the very action that might alleviate their suffering. Marcus was experiencing profound regret, but his avoidant programming interpreted any impulse to reach out to Sarah as weakness, as emotional dependency that needed to be suppressed. So he suffered in silence, creating elaborate fantasies about running into her accidentally, about her reaching out to him first, about scenarios where he could express his feelings without having to take responsibility for having left in the first place. Then there's the self-serving bias, which is our tendency to interpret events in ways that favor our self-image. Marcus began to rewrite the narrative of their relationship and its ending. He told himself that Sarah was better off without him, that he had done her a favor by leaving. He convinced himself that she was probably already dating someone else, someone who could give her what she deserved. This wasn't cruelty. It was his mind's attempt to protect him from the crushing weight of his own regret. But late at night, when his defenses were down, Marcus was haunted by memories of Sarah's laugh, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, the sense of peace he felt in her presence. He regretted leaving her, but admitting that regret would mean acknowledging that he had made a mistake, that his fear had cost him something precious, that he was capable of the very vulnerability he had spent his life avoiding. I watched this pattern repeat itself over months. Marcus would have good days where he convinced himself he had made the right choice, and terrible days where the weight of his decision felt unbearable. He never reached out to Sarah, but he never truly moved on either. He existed in a kind of emotional purgatory, sustained by the hope that somehow, someday, the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to take any emotional risks. The tragedy of Marcus's story isn't just that he lost someone who loved him. It's that his attachment style prevented him from learning from the experience. Instead of recognizing that his fear of vulnerability had cost him something valuable, he doubled down on his avoidant strategies. He threw himself into work, avoided dating, and gradually constructed an even more elaborate fortress around his heart. This is the pattern that defines the avoidant experience. They don't just regret leaving, they regret their inability to stay, their incapacity for the kind of emotional presence that relationships require. But rather than addressing these limitations, they often retreat further into behaviors that ensure they'll never have to face such vulnerability again. It's a self-perpetuating cycle that leaves both partners wounded, the avoidant trapped in their own psychological prison, and their former partner wondering what they could have done differently. The answer, more often than not, is nothing. Sarah could not have loved Marcus out of his avoidant attachment style. She could not have been patient enough, understanding enough, or perfect enough to overcome patterns that were established long before she entered his life. This is perhaps the hardest truth for those who love avoidance to accept. Sometimes love isn't enough, and someone's inability to receive love isn't a reflection of love's inadequacy. Now, understanding why avoidants regret leaving you is one thing, but knowing how to respond to this knowledge is quite another matter entirely. The first principle you must grasp is this: their regret doesn't equal readiness for change. Just because someone misses you doesn't mean they've developed the emotional tools necessary for a healthy relationship. Regret without insight is merely suffering without growth. If you find yourself wondering whether your avoidant ex is experiencing this kind of regret, look for subtle signs rather than grand gestures. They might like your social media posts from months ago, suggesting they've been scrolling through your entire history. They might frequent places you used to go together, hoping for an accidental encounter that would give them plausible deniability for contact. They might reach out with seemingly casual messages, testing the waters without committing to vulnerability. But here's what you must understand: these breadcrumbs are not necessarily invitations for reconciliation. Often, they're attempts to manage their own discomfort with loss without taking responsibility for the emotional work that real reconnection would require. Responding to these gestures with enthusiasm or hope often leads to a painful cycle where the avoidant feels reassured that you're still available, which paradoxically reduces their motivation to do the difficult work of addressing their attachment issues. Instead, I suggest what I call the compassionate boundary approach. This means acknowledging their humanity while protecting your own emotional well-being. If they reach out, you might respond kindly, but without eagerness. You don't ignore them completely, which would likely trigger their abandonment fears and confirm their belief that relationships are ultimately rejecting, but you also don't rush to reassure them that everything is forgiven and forgotten. The second crucial strategy is to resist the urge to become their emotional therapist. Many people who love avoidance fall into the trap of trying to help them understand their own psychology. They share articles about attachment theory. They explain how avoidant behavior impacts relationships. They offer patient understanding and encouragement for growth. While this comes from a place of love, it often backfires because it positions you as the pursuer in a dynamic where pursuit triggers avoidance. Instead, focus on your own attachment security. Use this experience as an opportunity to examine your own patterns. Ask yourself why you were drawn to someone who struggled with emotional availability. Consider whether you have anxious attachment tendencies that made the push-pull dynamic feel familiar or even exciting. Often, people who repeatedly find themselves in relationships with avoidance have their own attachment wounds that need attention. The third principle is to distinguish between someone who is genuinely working on their attachment issues and someone who is merely suffering from loss aversion. Genuine growth in an avoidant person typically involves therapy, self-reflection, and concrete changes in behavior patterns. They might acknowledge their role in the relationship's end without making excuses. They might demonstrate vulnerability in small, consistent ways rather than grand gestures that don't require sustained emotional risk. Someone who is merely experiencing loss aversion, on the other hand, will typically want to resume the relationship without addressing the underlying issues that caused its demise. They might promise change without demonstrating understanding of what needs to change. They might express regret about leaving without taking responsibility for the emotional unavailability that necessitated the leaving in the first place. Remember that timing matters enormously with avoidant regret. The immediate period after a breakup often feels like relief to an avoidant person. They've escaped the anxiety that intimacy created, and they congratulate themselves on avoiding further emotional entanglement. It's often weeks or months later, when loss aversion kicks in, when they begin to understand what they've actually given up. This delayed recognition can be particularly cruel for the person who was left, because by the time the avoidant experiences regret, their former partner may have begun the difficult work of moving on. If they do reach out during this period, it can feel like emotional whiplash for someone who has been processing abandonment and rejection. Therefore, my advice is to be extremely cautious about reconciliation unless you see evidence of genuine change, not just regret. Someone can miss you terribly while still being incapable of the emotional presence that a healthy relationship requires. They can love you deeply while lacking the tools to express that love in ways that feel nourishing rather than confusing. Consider also your own emotional capacity. Loving an avoidant person, even one who is actively working on their attachment issues, requires enormous emotional resilience. It means accepting that progress will be slow, that setbacks are likely, and that their way of expressing love may never match your expectations or needs. This isn't necessarily wrong, but it's important to be honest about whether this kind of relationship dynamic serves your own emotional well-being and growth. Finally, use this knowledge not as a strategy for winning them back, but as a tool for your own healing and future relationship choices. Understanding that their leaving wasn't really about you can free you from the exhausting work of trying to figure out what you could have done differently. Understanding that they likely do regret their decision can provide some comfort without creating false hope for reconciliation. The goal isn't to become bitter or closed off to love, but to develop the kind of secure attachment that naturally attracts emotionally available partners. When you truly understand your own worth and develop clear boundaries around how you want to be treated in relationships, you become less likely to accept the breadcrumbs and intermittent reinforcement that characterize relationships with avoidant individuals. So here we find ourselves, at the end of our exploration into one of love's most confounding mysteries. Yes, avoidants regret leaving you, but their regret is often a prison of their own making, constructed from the same fears that made them leave in the first place. They carry the weight of their decision like a secret they can't bear to examine too closely, because examining it would require the very vulnerability they've spent a lifetime avoiding. The tragedy isn't just in their leaving, but in their inability to transform regret into growth, to use the pain of loss as a catalyst for developing greater emotional capacity. Instead, they often retreat further into the patterns that created the problem in the first place, ensuring that future relationships will follow the same painful trajectory. But you, my dear viewer, you have a choice in how you respond to this knowledge. You can use it as a lifeline back to someone who hurt you, hoping that understanding their psychology will somehow change their capacity for intimacy. Or you can use it as wisdom, as a deeper understanding of human nature that helps you make better choices about where to invest your emotional energy. I would urge you toward the latter path, not because avoidant individuals are inherently bad people, they're not, but because your emotional well-being shouldn't depend on someone else's willingness to face their fears. Your capacity for love shouldn't be held hostage by another person's attachment wounds. Instead, let this understanding serve as a mirror for your own patterns. Ask yourself why their particular brand of emotional unavailability felt familiar. Examine whether you have a tendency to pursue those who retreat, to interpret inconsistency as passion, to mistake intensity for intimacy. Often, our attraction to avoidant individuals reveals something important about our own relationship with vulnerability and security. Take action on your own behalf. If you recognize yourself in the patterns we've discussed today, consider working with a therapist who specializes in attachment theory. Invest in relationships with friends and family members who can offer consistent emotional availability. Practice setting boundaries not as walls to keep people out, but as guidelines for how you want to be treated. Most importantly, don't let one person's inability to appreciate your worth diminish your belief in your own lovability. Their regret isn't validation that you needed, and their inability to express that regret isn't a reflection of your importance in their life. You deserve someone who doesn't have to lose you to recognize your value, someone who can stay present in love rather than fleeing from it. The most profound act of self-love you can perform is to stop waiting for emotionally unavailable people to become available. Stop hoping that your patience will be rewarded with their presence. Stop believing that if you just love them enough, understand them enough, or give them enough space, they'll overcome patterns that took decades to establish. Your love is not a rehabilitation project. Your heart is not a halfway house for people who aren't ready for emotional intimacy. You deserve to be chosen consistently, loved openly, and valued without reservation. Settling for less doesn't make you compassionate. It makes you complicit in your own diminishment. So let them regret in silence if they must. Let them carry the weight of their choices without making their burden your responsibility. You have your own life to live, your own capacity for joy to explore, your own path toward secure and lasting love to walk. And that path, I can assure you, leads away from those who can only love you in your absence, not toward them.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.